There are roads in America that exist outside of time. Not in any romantic sense. Not in the way travel writers mean when they describe a scenic byway cutting through autumn foliage or a coastal highway where the Pacific tilts silver in the morning light. Those roads invite you. They welcome the camera and the weekend drive and the Instagram story. Those roads want to be seen. Highway 9 in Calhoun Parish, Louisiana, is the other kind. It is a dead-flat two-lane strip of crumbling asphalt that cuts through 12 miles of unbroken pine barrens in the northwestern corner of the state, and it does not invite anything. It tolerates. It allows passage the way a sleeping animal allows you to move through its territory with the specific, breathless understanding that the tolerance is conditional and that the conditions are set by something other than you. The trees on both sides press close enough to the shoulder that their shadows fall across the road in long, irregular teeth throughout the day, so that even at midday, even in the full heat of a Louisiana summer, the light feels borrowed and temporary. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the land is mostly scrub and clay and the occasional rusted skeleton of a farm that gave up before anyone can remember. There are no businesses for 6 miles in either direction. There are no streetlights. There are no cameras mounted on utility poles, because the utility poles are too few and too far between to justify the investment. And because no one in a position to authorize the investment has ever had a reason to care what happened on this particular stretch of road at this particular hour of day. The asphalt itself tells the story of a road that receives maintenance the way it receives attention, reluctantly, infrequently, and only when the alternative becomes impossible to ignore. The yellow dividing lines are faded to near invisibility in places ghost stripes that ask more than they demand. The shoulder is gravel and compacted clay wide enough for a vehicle to pull over, and in several spots worn into shallow ruts that suggest vehicles pull over here with some regularity. Whether by choice or compulsion is a question the ruts cannot answer. On this afternoon in late August, the heat is doing what Louisiana heat does, not merely warming the air, but thickening it, pressing it down against the blacktop until the surface releases shimmering mirages that dance and ripple over the yellow lines and make the road ahead look liquid unstable, as though the ground itself has not fully decided what it wants to be. The pine trees are motionless. The air carries the specific heavy perfume of pine resin and red clay baking in direct sun, with underneath it the faint brackish suggestion of a creek somewhere in the tree line, though the creek, if it exists, is invisible from the road. There are no other vehicles. There are no pedestrians. There is no one watching anything. This is precisely the point. Calhoun Parish has a documented history, the kind that lives in filing cabinets, in federal offices, and in the memories of the people who drive these roads every day. It is the kind of history that does not make headlines, because it is composed not of single dramatic events, but of an accumulated weight of small, repeated daily violations that never quite cross the threshold that would require someone important to pay attention. Excessive force complaints fused and dismissed. Traffic stops that produced no citations and left no record except a notation in a deputy's log. Residents who learned over years which roads to avoid at which hours, not because those roads were dangerous in any conventional sense, but because a certain kind of danger lived on them, wore a khaki uniform, and had a brother-in-law who signed the paperwork. The federal office in New Orleans has a thin file on Calhoun Parish. It has been thin for 9 years. It is about to become very thick. But right now, in the late afternoon of an August day, there is only the road and the heat and the mirages dancing over the yellow lines and the distant sound of a single V8 engine moving at a lawful speed through the piney silence. The 1971 Ford F-100 was not the kind of truck that announced itself. It was the color of old red clay after rain, a deep dusty burgundy that had been resprayed at some point in the early 90s and had since developed the particular patina that only comes from decades of actual use, actual weather, and actual road. The chrome on the bumper was original and therefore imperfect, slightly pitted, where the Louisiana humidity had done its patient work over 50 years. The tires were newer than the body aggressively treaded, because Elijah had learned early that the only part of any vehicle worth spending real money on was the part that actually touched the ground. The V8 engine had been rebuilt by Elijah himself over the course of 14 months in his garage at Fort Polk, working on weekends and the occasional late evening, and it ran with a deep, unhurried authority that was technically much more than the truck needed for civilian highway use, and that Elijah found on long drives deeply and inexplicably comforting. He was 41 years old. He was black. He had grown up in Shreveport, the youngest of 3 children, raised by a woman who worked double shifts at Oxnard Medical Center for 22 years and who told all 3 of her children with a regularity that bordered on liturgical that excellence was not optional and that mediocrity was the most expensive thing in the world for people who looked like them. He had taken this seriously in the way that second children often do not, with the burdened, performative intensity of an oldest child, not with the relaxed creativity of the youngest, but with a kind of quiet structural thoroughness that expressed itself in the way he organized information, the way he planned for contingencies, the way he entered every situation having already calculated 3 exits. He had entered the United States Army at 19, having declined an academic scholarship to LSU in favor of the Rangers recruiting pitch delivered by a staff sergeant who visited his high school, and who was the first person who had ever suggested to Elijah that the particular quality of his attention, that calm, assessing stillness, was not merely a personality trait, but a tactical asset. He had been right. Elijah had completed Ranger School on his first attempt, which approximately 60% of candidates did not do, and had spent the subsequent 22 years building a career that was decorated in the most literal sense of the word, a Distinguished Service Cross, earned in the Korengal Valley in 2009 during an engagement that lasted 11 hours and during which Elijah had, among other things, moved under direct fire to recover 2 wounded soldiers who would not have survived another 10 minutes in the position they were in. 2 Purple Hearts, one from a fragment that took a piece of his left calf in 2011, one from a round that passed through the meat of his right shoulder in 2016, and exited cleanly enough that he was back in the field in 18 days, which his medical officer had described as genuinely inadvisable, and which Elijah had described as necessary. A collection of additional commendations that occupied a full shadow box, and that he kept always in the canvas duffel bag on his passenger seat when he drove, because the duffel went where he went, and where he went, the Army went, and there was a version of himself that was always on some level in transit between one thing and the next. Right now, he was in transit between 3 weeks of field training exercises at Fort Polk, exhausting in the specific way that command-level field training is exhausting, which is less physical and more the accumulated weight of 3 weeks of making decisions that hundreds of people's safety depended on, and the overnight staging area 40 miles up the road where his battalion would consolidate before returning to post. He had been granted permission to drive his personal vehicle ahead of the convoy, a standing arrangement for commanders who needed to coordinate logistics at the destination before the main element arrived, and he was exercising that permission, now driving at 48 miles per hour in a 55 zone, both hands at 10, and the radio off the window cracked 2 inches to let in the pine-scented air. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt that fit close across his shoulders and chest in the way that clothing fits men who train seriously and consistently. Worn jeans, desert boots that had not started out as casual footwear and that retained in their construction the suggestion of their original purpose. Nothing about him was designed to signal anything. That was the intention. After 3 weeks of being every waking moment the highest-ranking person in a large and consequential space, the simplicity of a civilian shirt and an old truck on an empty road was its own kind of rest. On the passenger seat, the canvas duffel sat open at the top, the flap folded back. At the edge of the opening, just barely visible, was the corner of a carefully folded American flag, the tight triangular fold of a military burial flag given to Elijah not at a funeral, but as a mark of honor and kept with the reverence that the gesture deserved. Beside it, the corner of the shadow box was just visible dark wood frame, the glass catching the afternoon light at a low angle. He did not look at these things as he drove. He knew where they were. They had been in that bag for so long that their position was as familiar to him as the positions of the instruments on his dashboard. He checked his speedometer. 48. Clean. His hands were steady on the wheel. His breathing was slow and even. He was in the way that only certain kinds of experience produce completely at peace and completely alert. These two things are not in contradiction in the same way that a still lake is not the same thing as a stagnant one. There was water moving under the surface. There was attention moving under the stillness. The particular attention of a black man who has spent a significant portion of his adult life driving through the American South and who knows with the precision of someone who has run the numbers enough times to stop it being surprised by them what the mathematics of driving while black on a rural Louisiana highway looks like. He noticed the pull-off behind the billboard for a distance of about a quarter mile before he passed it, because he noticed pull-offs on this kind of road the way he noticed high ground in unfamiliar terrain automatically without effort, the way certain kinds of experience rewire the brain's baseline awareness. He did not slow down. He did not speed up. He maintained 48 in a 55 both hands at 10 and 2. And he passed the pull-off and watched in his rearview mirror for what he had already calculated a 73% probability of seeing next. He was right, of course. He almost always was. The arrangement had been Captain Darnell Okafor's idea, technically, though Elijah had approved it and considered it sound. Okafor was 34 years old, black from Memphis, the kind of executive officer who made a battalion commander's life easier not by anticipating problems, but by solving them in the narrow window between when they emerged and when they became serious, a distinction that required both intelligence and nerve, and that Okafor possessed in roughly equal measure. He ran the convoy with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done it enough times in enough difficult places that a convoy through rural Louisiana in peacetime felt logistically like a brisk walk after years of competitive running. The convoy was 22 vehicles in total. 2 JLTVs, joint light tactical vehicles, each weighing approximately 14,000 pounds, painted in matte desert tan and olive drab. Each carrying a gunner behind a ballistic glass shield at the turret led and closed the column. Between them, 3 LMTV troop transports carrying 2 platoons of Rangers in full kit, 2 Stryker fighting vehicles whose size and presence on a 2-lane Louisiana highway would under normal circumstances require a special use permit from the State Transportation Department, and a collection of support vehicles, a maintenance truck, 2 fuel carriers, a command vehicle. The column, when stretched to tactical spacing, extended nearly a mile in length. It was moving at convoy speed, which was not slow. Okafor had closed the distance from the standard 3-mile separation to approximately 2 miles without making a production of it. A quiet tightening of the column that the drivers executed without being told explicitly why. Because Okafor's voice on the internal net when he gave the order carried the particular tone that communicates everything necessary without stating it. In the lead JLTV, Okafor sat in the right front seat with one hand resting on his knee and his attention divided between the road ahead, the tactical display on his dashboard, and the small speaker clipped to his vest collar from which Elijah's open channel transmitted with remarkable clarity. The tactical headset in the F-100 was a standard military issue unit, compact enough to sit unnoticed on an air vent paired to the encrypted command frequency that the entire convoy monitored during movement. Elijah had tapped the transmit button the moment the lights had appeared in his rearview mirror, not in panic, not even in particular urgency, but with the routine practicality of a man who had built the habit of creating records, because records were the thing that survived when everything else became contested. Every word spoken on the shoulder of Highway 9 was transmitting. The Rangers in the troop transport behind Okafor were quiet in the way that soldiers are quiet when they are paying attention rather than resting. Several of them had caught fragments of the open channel audio bleeding through the internal net and had exchanged glances, the specific kind of glance that communicates understanding without requiring confirmation. Their hands rested on their weapons with the practiced looseness of people for whom that is simply a resting position. Okafor had already patched through to Louisiana State Police Dispatch. He had done it with the calm, clipped precision of a man filing a routine report, which it was not, and the dispatcher on the other end had needed to ask him to repeat himself twice before the content of the report landed. A senior federal officer had been detained at gunpoint by a local deputy sheriff on Highway 9 in Calhoun Parish. The detention was ongoing. The officer was unharmed but restrained, and a military convoy would be arriving at the location in approximately 4 minutes. The dispatcher had gone quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Okafor had also placed a call to the Calhoun Parish Sheriff's Office, main line, leaving a message with the duty officer that was similarly precise, similarly calm, and similarly designed to ensure that there was a record of notification that predated whatever record the sheriff's office would eventually construct for its own purposes. He had done all of this while the convoy rolled through Pine Barrens at convoy speed without raising his voice or changing his expression. Because Okafor was the kind of executive officer he was, and because Elijah had chosen him for exactly these qualities, and because the thing that separates good command from bad command is almost never courage, it is almost always the presence of mind to do the right things in the right order, while other people are still trying to figure out what is happening. The convoy did not slow down. The pine trees streamed past. 2 miles ahead in the shoulder gravel of Highway 9, a green LED blinked steadily on a tactical headset clipped to the air vent of a 1971 Ford F-100. Deputy Russell Holt had not noticed it. He would. Russell Holt had been a deputy sheriff in Calhoun Parish for 19 years, and in that time he had accumulated several things. He had accumulated 31 complaints filed against him by members of the public for excessive force, for unlawful detention, for verbal abuse, for conduct unbecoming, for violations of the Fourth Amendment that were described in the complaints with varying levels of legal precision, but with a consistency of narrative that, taken together, told a story that any reasonable person reading them in sequence would have found deeply alarming. He had accumulated these complaints the way certain kinds of men accumulate them, which is to say, with the relaxed confidence of someone who has never once experienced a consequence and who has long since stopped considering consequences as a variable in his calculations. Every single one of those 31 complaints had been received, logged, reviewed, and dismissed by the Calhoun Parish Sheriff's Office Internal Affairs Division, which was not technically a division so much as a desk, and which was occupied by Chief Deputy Warren Greer, who was Russell Holt's wife's older brother and who had been processing Holt's complaint history with the thoroughness of a man shredding documents before an audit. He had accumulated 19 years of what the department called seniority, and what the community on Highway 9 called something else a dominion, a tax, a toll. He was known among the people who had no choice but to know him, as a man who treated the road as his personal revenue stream and the people on it as an inventory of opportunities. He had never been formally investigated. He had never been suspended. He had never been required to attend any training that altered his behavior in any observable way. He had also accumulated a reputation in the local law enforcement community, not among the younger deputies who either feared him or were being trained by him to replicate him, but among the state troopers who occasionally worked the region and who had learned through experience that Holt's stops on Highway 9 had a specific character. They happened to black drivers at a rate that was statistically impossible to attribute to chance. They almost never resulted in citations, and the drivers who experienced them almost never reported them, which told its own story about what those drivers had learned to expect from the reporting process. He was 47 years old. He was a large man in the specific way that suggests a body that was once genuinely powerful and that has since shifted its investment toward mass rather than strength. A gut that strained the buttons of his khaki uniform. Shirt arms that were still thick, but whose thickness was no longer primarily muscle. A broad face that was permanently flushed at the cheeks and chin in a way that could have been sun damage and could have been something else. His sunglasses were aviator style, the lenses dark enough to make his eyes invisible, which he preferred. His hair was cut very short gray at the temples, and would have been unremarkable, except for the slight sheen of perspiration that was already visible at his hairline in the afternoon heat. His uniform was pressed but not immaculate, the kind of pressed that happens in the morning and deteriorates through the day, so that by mid-afternoon it carries the rumpled authority of someone who started out trying and then stopped. He chewed tobacco. He had chewed tobacco for 23 years, and the habit had left its mark on the interior of his left cheek and on the small plastic bottle he kept in his center console for the specific purpose that plastic bottles served in that context. He was chewing now in the pull-off behind a weather-beaten billboard advertising a personal injury law firm in Shreveport. And he was watching Highway 9 through his windshield, with the particular patience of a man who has done a thing so many times that the waiting has become genuinely pleasant. He had radioed dispatch 12 minutes ago with a notation about a suspicious vehicle on Highway 9, no further details, no license plate, no description. Specific enough to be verifiable. He did this before every stop he intended to make. It was his insurance policy, written before the premium was due, a vague pre-existing record that could be cited afterward as the reason for the stop, regardless of the actual reason. He had developed this practice early in his career and had refined it over 2 decades to the point where it was automatic, reflexive, as natural as checking his sidearm before stepping out of the vehicle. The philosophy that animated Russell Holt was not complex, but it was complete. He believed with the settled conviction of a man who has never seriously been required to examine his beliefs that the road was his territory, that his badge was his authority, and that authority to be meaningful had to be exercised visibly regularly, and in ways that reminded the people who used his road what the power structure was. He did not think of this as racism, partly because he had never in his adult life been required to think carefully about what racism actually was and meant, and partly because the word in his interior vocabulary was associated with something extreme and theatrical. Burning crosses, shouted slurs, the gross historical performances of a century ago, rather than with the quiet, structural daily practice of treating certain human beings as a categorically lower order of priority than others. He simply believed that certain kinds of people on certain kinds of roads at certain times of day warranted attention. He believed this the way gravity works, not as a choice but as a fact, something he had never formulated into words because it had never needed formulating. He watched the dusty burgundy F-100 come down Highway 9 at a speed that was frustratingly entirely lawful. He noted the driver. He reached for his lights. The lights went on without the siren. This was deliberate. A siren announces. It gives time to prepare, to compose, to think. Lights alone startle. They create the moment of disorientation. That Holt preferred the split second where a driver's body floods with adrenaline before their brain has had a chance to organize a response, and in that split second, the tone of the entire encounter is set. It was a small thing, a tiny tactical choice, and it had been refined over 19 years until it was instinct. In the F-100, Elijah saw the lights in his rearview mirror and did not flinch. He had been expecting them since the pull-off. Not hoping for them, not welcoming them, but expecting them the way you expect rain when you have watched the clouds build all morning. He let the adrenaline arrive, and then he let it settle. The way he had trained himself to do in situations where adrenaline was the enemy rather than the resource, and he ran through the protocol with the same methodical care that he applied to everything else. Right turn signal, activated, speed reduction, smooth, no braking, that could be characterized as erratic. Shoulder, wide and clear. He chose the longest, most visible stretch he could see, no curves, no obstructions, because visibility cuts both ways. Engine off, window down, dome light on. Both hands at 10 and 2 fingers spread and visible palms forward. He had been through this protocol enough times in his life that he could run it without thinking. And he did not want to think about it, because thinking about the fact that he was a 41-year-old decorated combat veteran who had earned the Distinguished Service Cross in service to this country, and who was nonetheless required to perform a specific ritual of non-threatening body language just to survive a traffic stop, was a thought that lived several stories underground in a place he only visited when he had the privacy and the time to deal with what he found there. In his mirror, he watched the cruiser door open. Deputy Russell Holt got out of his vehicle and walked. There is a particular walk that a certain kind of law enforcement officer develops. Not all of them, not even most, but a specific kind. And it is not the walk of a person moving through space from point A to point B. It is a walk that is performed, that is designed to communicate something that is itself a kind of speech. It announces occupation of territory. It announces time, the implication that time here is determined by the walker, not by anyone else, and that the person waiting at the end of the walk will wait for as long as the walking takes. Holt's walk was extremely good at being this kind of walk. He had practiced it for 19 years. He stopped at the B pillar just behind Elijah's shoulder, forcing a neck turn that put Elijah at an awkward angle that made maintaining eye contact physically uncomfortable, that ensured that Elijah would not see Holt's face fully until Holt decided to present it. This was also practiced. This was also deliberate. License registration and proof of insurance. Holt said, "Not good afternoon, sir." Not, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Not anything that acknowledged that the person in the truck was a human being with whom Holt was entering into a social interaction. Just the command. Flat. Final. Dripping with the specific condescension of a man who believes that the performance of authority requires no courtesy to be legitimate. "Good afternoon, Deputy." Elijah's voice was even, deep. It filled the cab and the space outside the window without effort, without strain, without any audible trace of the thing he was managing underneath it. He had spent 22 years commanding troops in high-stress environments, and his voice had been shaped by that into something that had a kind of structural integrity to it. You could push against it, and it would not move. "My wallet is in my back right pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" The question was polite and precise, and it was also a record. A verbal record broadcasting live to Okafor's command vehicle that Elijah had announced his intentions before moving, that he had asked for the deputy's direction, that he was doing everything correctly. Holt would not have known this. Holt was not thinking about records. Holt leaned in. The smell arrived first: stale coffee, chewing tobacco. The slightly sour undertone of a man who had been in a cruiser in Louisiana, August heat, for several hours. His face came to the window, his aviator lenses scanning the interior of the cab with the proprietary gaze of a man checking his own property. "I said, give me your damn ID, boy. I didn't ask for a conversation." The word landed in the space between them and stayed there. Elijah's jaw did not move. His hands did not move. His breathing pattern did not change. Somewhere in his chest, in the deep structure of who he was, something registered the word with a precise, quiet pain that he had learned to acknowledge and then set aside the way you set aside a sharp thing so you can use both hands for something more important. He had faced down armed insurgents in the Korangal Valley at 3 in the morning. He had made decisions in 11 continuous hours of contact fire that he would carry for the rest of his life. A small county deputy with a tobacco habit and a 19-year winning streak was not going to break his composure. He was simply not. "I am reaching for my back pocket now," Deputy Elijah said, and reached and retrieved his wallet and extracted his driver's license and held it through the window between two fingers, the precise, deliberate offer of a man who is making sure that every movement is visible and unambiguous. Then, with the same telegraphed slowness, he opened the glove box and produced the registration and the insurance card organized together in a small folder exactly where they always were. Holt snatched the documents from his hand. He looked at the license. He looked at Elijah. He looked at the license again. And then the smile appeared, slow, mocking the smile of a man who has found the thing he was looking for, which is to say, the thing he invented before he started looking. Benjamin Carter Holt read aloud deliberately, misreading the name on the license, stretching the pronunciation of Ross into something unrecognizable, reducing it to a sound rather than a name. "You're a long way from home, Benji." He held the license up at an angle, tilting it, as though examining something suspicious about the lamination, though the lamination was perfectly standard. "Whose truck is this? Pretty nice ride for a guy who looks like you. A beat. You steal it from a job site." Elijah looked straight ahead. The pine trees across the highway were motionless in the thick afternoon air. A distant woodpecker hammered somewhere in the tree line. 3 beats a pause, 3 beats, with an industrious indifference to everything happening on the shoulder. "The vehicle is registered in my name, Deputy Elijah," said, his eyes returning to the road ahead, "as the documentation clearly proves. May I ask why I was pulled over?" The question was reasonable. The question was politely phrased. The question was the kind of question that a citizen has an unambiguous legal right to ask, and that a law enforcement officer operating within the bounds of his authority has an obligation to answer. Holt heard it as something else entirely. He heard it as challenge. He heard it as the particular affront of a person who was not behaving in the way that persons in this situation, on this road, on his road, were supposed to behave. "You crossed the yellow line back there," Holt said. It was a lie, and it was a good lie. By the standards of lies that are easy to tell and hard to disprove, except that Okafor's driver had dashcam footage from the convoy's lead vehicle that had been capturing Highway 9 from 3 miles back, and that footage would eventually matter enormously. But Holt did not know about the dashcam footage any more than he knew about the tactical headset. "And your exhaust is entirely too loud. Plus, you're acting nervous, suspicious." He paused, apparently constructing the rest of the justification in real time. "Fact is, you fit the description of a suspect we got a call about. Break in a few towns over." "I haven't crossed any lines," Deputy Elijah said, his tone remaining perfectly level, each word placed with the care of a man who knows that words right now are the most important thing. "And my exhaust is factory standard. I'm not acting nervous. I am sitting perfectly still with my hands on the wheel." "Are you arguing with me, boy?" The word again. Twice now. Also transmitting. Holt's voice had dropped an octave, the thin veneer of procedural neutrality entirely gone. He took a half step back from the window, and his right hand moved to his duty belt, and the specific sound of a leather retention strap being unsnapped, that sharp, soft, leather against leather click, entered the afternoon air, and stayed there, carrying with it a meaning that required no translation. "Because out here on this road, I am the law." He let that sit for a moment, because he had said it before and he knew how it landed. Had felt the way it rearranged the air in situations like this. "And right now I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle. That gives me probable cause to search it." He said the last sentence with the ease of a man quoting something he has memorized, which he essentially had. The marijuana claim was the oldest, most durable lie in a certain playbook. It was virtually impossible to disprove in the moment, required nothing to support it, and produced a legal justification for whatever came next. It had served Holt well for the better part of a decade on this road. "Step out of the truck." Elijah took one breath. 2. He was running calculations, not emotional ones, but practical ones. He knew the law with an intimacy that most civilians do not, because he had been required by the circumstances of his life and career to know it. He knew that Holt's claimed marijuana smell was fabricated, knew it with the certainty of someone who has not been near marijuana in any form for longer than he can clearly remember. He knew that the stop itself lacked legitimate foundation. He knew his rights with the precision of someone who had studied them and memorized them, not out of academic interest, but out of the specific necessity of survival. He also knew what happened to black men who exercised their rights on isolated roads in front of cops whose retention straps were already unsnapped. There was one more thing to do before he got out, Deputy Stone Elijah said, and his voice had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but the quality of it had changed in a way that was subtle and unmistakable, the way a note changes when you move from one octave to the next. It carried suddenly the specific resonance of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I do not consent to any searches or seizures. There is no marijuana in this vehicle, nor has there ever been. I am a federally employed officer, and I strongly advise you to run my name through your dispatch before you escalate this situation any further." A pause. "You are making a profound mistake." Holt's face flushed. It went from its normal flushed pink to a deeper, more violent crimson in the space of a few seconds, the color of a man whose ego has been touched in its most sensitive place, which for Holt was the suggestion that he had done something wrong, that his authority was not absolute, that the person in front of him had any standing from which to offer advice. The vein at the side of his neck became visible, a blue-green cord pressing against the skin. He took a step forward and then another. "I'm going to give you 3 seconds to step out of that truck," Holt said, his voice going tight and high in the way that voices go when the veneer has come off entirely, and what's underneath is just animal. Just threat, just the raw machinery of a man who has never been stopped. Or, I will drag you through that window and beat the compliance into you. He paused. Something was happening in his chest, something chemical and electrical. The adrenaline of his own aggression feeding itself, and it made his voice louder and less controlled than he had intended. 1. He reached for his holster. 2. He didn't reach 3. The Glock 22 came out of the holster with the practiced motion of 19 years and leveled at Elijah's left temple, the barrel black steel, catching the afternoon light at the exact angle that made it look most like what it was, and Holt's voice broke into something that was not entirely a shout and not entirely a scream, but occupied the unpleasant territory between them. Get out of the damn truck before I blow your head off. Hands in the air. Do it now. In the cab of the F-100 Elijah Cross was still. Not frozen, still. There is a distinction. Frozen is what happens when the brain encounters something it hasn't prepared for and can't process when the system seizes up under overload. Still is what happens when the brain has been prepared, when experience has built through repetition and discipline and the accumulated weight of very high stakes, a structure that holds under pressure. Elijah had been under fire in the literal sense, had been in situations where rounds were coming in and the margin between alive and dead was measured in fractions of a second, and the quality of your response to that specific moment. His nervous system had been trained over 2 decades to meet extreme threat not with panic, but with precision. He looked at the barrel of the gun. He assessed the man holding it. Russell Holt was not a man in control of himself. Holt was a man whose ego had sent him further into this situation than his intelligence could sustain, and who was now running on the adrenaline of his own threat, which was a volatile and unpredictable state. A man in that state with a loaded weapon at someone's temple and his finger close to the trigger could accidentally do the worst thing. The smallest wrong move, anything that Holt could process as resistance, as challenge, as the justification he was in some corner of his mind already constructing, could make this the last afternoon of Elijah's life. So Elijah moved with the most deliberate, telegraphed, exaggerated slowness he had ever applied to a physical action in his life. I am complying, Deputy, he said, his voice steady. I am going to use my left hand to open the door. I am moving slowly. He did exactly what he said. Left hand to the door handle, elbow to push the door open. Both hands raising above his shoulders as he stepped out onto the gravel shoulder. The warm afternoon air immediately wrapping around him, the smell of pine and hot asphalt, replacing the interior smell of the truck. He straightened to his full height, 6 feet 1 broad across the shoulders, standing in the August sun with his hands above his head and his face composed into the specific neutrality of a man who has made the decision to survive this moment at whatever cost the moment requires. Holt came around the door. What happened next was fast and rough, and designed to hurt more than it needed to. Holt grabbed Elijah by the back of the neck, not by the collar, by the neck, fingers digging into the muscle and skin, and pivoted him toward the bed of the truck, slamming his chest against the tailgate with enough force that the metal groaned and the air went out of Elijah's lungs in a controlled rush. The gravel shifted under his boots, his cheek pressed against the dusty paint of the truck bed. Holt patted him down with the aggressive thoroughness of someone looking for both evidence and opportunities, checking pockets, waistband ankles, moving through it quickly and roughly. He found nothing except keys and a phone, and in the breast pocket of the gray t-shirt, a small folded piece of paper that turned out to be a fuel receipt from a gas station near Fort Polk. The handcuffs came out. They went on tight. 2 notches past where they should have been, the metal biting into the bones of Elijah's wrists, immediately the pressure already building into the specific deep ache of restricted circulation. Elijah said nothing about this. He noted it the way he noted everything. Catalogued it. I see ya need it. Not so tough now, are you? Military boy, Holt said close to his ear, chewing tobacco breath, a murmur designed for Elijah and no one else. Federal officer. My ass. You're just another thug who thinks he knows the law. He grabbed Elijah by the bicep fingers, digging deep enough that there would be bruising visible for 8 days afterward, as the medical examination conducted 48 hours later would document, and shoved him toward the front of the cruiser. Stand right there. Don't move a muscle, or I'll tase you until your heart stops." And then Holt turned and walked toward the F-100. He opened the driver's side door with the proprietary ease of a man who has done this before, who has climbed into the personal vehicles of strangers and gone through their things and never encountered anything that made him hesitate. He pulled the seat covers back. He went through the glove box, throwing its contents onto the floorboard, the maintenance records that Elijah kept organized in a clear plastic sleeve, the owner's manual in its original sleeve, a pen, a small flashlight. He moved to the back seat, checked under it, found nothing. Then his hands found the canvas duffel on the passenger seat. He grabbed it and pulled it toward him. From the hood of the cruiser where he stood, hands cuffed behind him, Elijah watched in the truck's side mirror. The angle was imperfect, but sufficient. He saw Holt's hands go into the bag. He saw Holt's body language change slightly as the hands found something solid. He saw Holt pull the shadow box out of the duffel. Elijah's jaw clamped shut so hard that he would notice the soreness in his temporomandibular joint 3 days later. His breathing remained controlled. His face remained still. But something in the deepest and oldest part of him, something that had absolutely nothing to do with rank or protocol or the tactical headset transmitting on the open frequency, went very, very quiet, in the way that you go quiet when you are watching something precious being handled by someone incapable of understanding what they are touching. Holt held the shadow box up and looked at it, the way people look at things they encounter in a context that doesn't match their expectation, with a blankness that is not stupidity, but is the temporary paralysis of a brain trying to resolve an incongruity. The Distinguished Service Cross. The Purple Hearts. The folded flag. 3 things that have a specific weight and a specific meaning and a specific history of what they cost the person who earned them. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Holt's face, something that might, in a better man, have been the beginning of understanding. Then it went away. Stolen valor. Holt muttered to himself. The word was quiet, almost inaudible, but Elijah caught it in the side mirror, saw the shape of it, more than heard it. Saw Holt shake his head slightly, as though confirming a suspicion. Saw him set the shadow box down on the driver's seat, face down the glass, pressing against the cloth of the seat, the decorations hidden, and go back to rummaging in the duffel. Holt did not notice the tactical headset on the air vent. He did not notice the small green LED blinking steadily every 2 seconds, indicating an active encrypted transmission. He did not notice that the pine forest had gone slightly quieter than it had been a few minutes ago, that the woodpecker had stopped its hammering, that the birds in the upper canopy of the tree line, the ones that had been moving through the branches with the casual indifference of creatures who have no stake in human events, had stilled. He would not notice any of this for another 90 seconds, and by then, the gravel at his feet would already be beginning to vibrate. In the lead JLT-5, Captain Darnell Okafor had gone very still. This was not the same kind of stillness as Elijah's, though it came from a similar discipline. Okafor's stillness was the stillness of a man making a series of rapid, consequential decisions and not wasting any movement on anything that was not directly in service of those decisions. He had been listening to the open channel since Elijah first keyed transmit, and he had cataloged everything with the methodical precision of an executive officer who understands that everything he hears right now is going to matter later in rooms and contexts that will require it to be organized and usable. He had heard the lights going on without a siren. He had heard the demand license registration and proof of insurance, now with no greeting, no reason given. He had heard the word the deputy used twice. He had heard the fabricated justifications cycle through their predictable sequence, cross the line, loud, exhaust fits. A description smells marijuana. He had heard the retention strap unsnap. And then he had heard the thing that moved him from controlled monitoring to action, the count beginning and the sound of the holster opening. Close the distance, he had said to his driver, and his driver had understood immediately and accelerated without requiring an explanation. Because Okafor's voice had the quality it had, and because Okafor's drivers learned within the first week of serving under him to trust that quality without delay. 22 vehicles had increased their speed in unison, the column tightening like a fist, the tactical spacing maintained, but the interval between vehicles compressed to something closer than highway norms and appropriate to the situation developing ahead. Okafor had already placed the call to Louisiana State Police. He had done it with the efficiency of a man dialing a number he keeps in working memory because he has considered that he might need it, a brief, precise notification delivered in the clipped vocabulary of someone accustomed to briefing situations in real time. The dispatcher on the other end had needed to process the content for a moment that was slightly too long, and Okafor had used that moment to also reach the Calhoun Parish Sheriff's Office duty line, leaving a message with the duty officer that was equally clipped, equally precise, and equally designed to ensure that no one involved in the subsequent proceedings could claim they hadn't been notified. He had done all of this in approximately 4 minutes, while the convoy closed the distance from 3 miles to just under 1. Now he sat with one hand resting on his knee and the other near, but not on his radio, and he listened to the open channel deliver the sound of steel handcuffs clicking onto Elijah's wrists. He listened to the sound of a vehicle door opening and the sounds of a search being conducted, things being moved, things being dropped, the particular acoustic signature of someone going through a personal space without care or permission. And then a pause. And then very quietly, 2 words, stolen valor. Okafor looked straight ahead through the windshield. The highway was still empty ahead of them. They were coming up the long, gradual rise of the hill. The crest was perhaps 800 yards away, and beyond it, from what his GPS told him, and what his own memory of this route confirmed, was a long straight descent into a flat stretch where Highway 9 ran as straight as a ruler for over a mile, where Elijah was standing in handcuffs against the hood of a police cruiser. Convoy Element Alpha Okafor said into the internal net, his voice carrying the specific calibration that communicated everything necessary in a sentence and a half. We are going to the shoulder of Highway 9 approximately 1.2 miles ahead. We stop when I tell you to stop. Formation holds until I exit. No weapons raised unless I give the command. Is that understood? It was not a question. The net crackled back with acknowledgments. In the troop transport behind the lead JLTV, 2 platoons of Army Rangers checked their gear with the quiet automatic efficiency of people who have been waiting for something to do, and who now have something to do. No one raised their voice. No one asked questions. They watched their platoon leaders, and their platoon leaders were watching the ramp, and the ramp was still up, and there was nothing to do yet except be ready, which they were. The convoy crested the hill. The vibration arrived before the sound, which is the way it always works when the source is large enough and the ground is the right kind of solid. Russell Holt felt it in his boots first. He was reaching into the bottom of the duffel bag, his hand moving through folded fabric, looking for whatever he was looking for and not finding it. And then there was a sensation in the soles of his feet that was not quite a vibration and not quite a pressure, but was something between them, a deep subsonic irregularity in the surface he was standing on that his body registered before his brain had categorized it. Like standing on a train platform when a train is still in the tunnel, before you can hear it, when all you have is the feeling in your feet that something with mass is coming. He paused. He stood up and looked around with the instinctive wariness of an animal that has caught a smell it doesn't recognize. The gravel on the shoulder of Highway 9 was moving. Not dramatically, not visibly shifting en masse, but each individual piece of stone was jumping tiny random hops, the collective result resembling a simmer. Holt stared at the gravel for a moment with the specific confusion of someone whose eyes are receiving information that their existing category system cannot process. Inside his cruiser, the half-empty bottle of water in the cup holder was trembling. He could see it from where he stood, concentric circles moving outward across the water's surface, expanding and overlapping the physical signature of something rhythmic and powerful, and getting larger. The birds in the pine trees erupted in a single panicked mass Dozens of them, lifting from the upper canopy all at once, dark shapes bursting from the tree line and wheeling against the pale afternoon sky in that specific way that birds move when they have been startled by something large and unfamiliar. A murder of crows, black and ragged against the blue, going fast and going away. The vibration in Holt's boots became audible. It became in the space of a few seconds something that was no longer merely felt, but heard, a low, deep, rhythmic mechanical thunder that had the specific character of large diesel engines, the kind of diesel engines that are built not for efficiency, but for power, for sustained output at high torque, the kind that powers vehicles weighing more than 10 times what his cruiser weighed. Holt slowly pulled his hand out of the duffel bag. He straightened up. He looked down the long, straight ribbon of Highway 9. At the crest of the hill, a shape appeared. It was the lead JLTV, and even at distance, even before the full scale of it was apparent, something about its dimensions was wrong for what Holt's brain expected to see on this road. It was too wide. It was too tall. Its LED headlights were the wrong kind of light, too bright, too focused, cutting through the afternoon heat haze with the precision of purpose-built tactical lighting rather than the diffuse glow of civilian vehicles. It came over the hill at speed, and its presence on the road had the quality of something that had changed the fundamental nature of the space it occupied. Then the second vehicle crested the hill behind it, then the third, then the fourth and the fifth, and the shape of what was happening. The scale of it, the columns stretching back over the hill, as vehicle after vehicle after vehicle came into view, began to resolve itself into something that Russell Holt's brain could not accommodate within any framework he had ever used to understand the world. He took a step back from the F-100. His hand drifted toward his holster. It was pure instinct, the reaching for the familiar thing when the unfamiliar thing arrives. His fingers closed around the grip of the Glock before some other part of his brain sent a message that arrived in the form of a clear, cold understanding. The thing coming down this road was not something a Glock 22 was relevant to. The thing coming down this road was not something that a Glock 22 registered as a consideration. He took another step back. "They're just passing through," he told himself, his voice barely audible, the words not quite convincing even in his own head. National Guard heading to Fort Stewart. Just passing through. The lead JLTV was closing fast, 100 yards, 75. 50. It did not slow down. Then it did. The air brakes on the lead JLTV engaged with a sound that was less like a mechanical process and more like a declaration, a sustained high-pressure scream of compressed air and heavy rubber meeting asphalt that filled the Louisiana afternoon and then echoed off the pine trees and came back. The vehicle, all 14,000 pounds of it, decelerated with a violence that still, despite the braking, brought it off the road and onto the shoulder. With its massive tires tearing deep irregular channels through the gravel displacement waves of small stones fanning out from each tire like a boat wake dust billowing in a thick brown cloud. And it came to a stop with its front bumper 12 feet from the hood of Holt's cruiser. The ground shook when it stopped, not figuratively. The impact of 14,000 pounds of military vehicle transferring its momentum into the gravel shoulder of a Louisiana state road created a physical tremor that traveled through the ground and up through the soles of Russell Holt's boots and into his spine, and he felt it the way you feel the bass note of a very large speaker in your chest. The second vehicle, the LMTV troop transport. The massive flatbed whose cargo hold could accommodate a full platoon in full kit did not stop behind the JLTV. It swung wide, its enormous tires straddling the center line, and came to a halt, blocking the full northbound lane of Highway 9, effectively sealing the road behind Holt's position. The third vehicle came up fast from behind and angled across the southbound shoulder, completing the box. Holt's cruiser was enclosed. There was no forward. There was no reverse. There was no sideways. There were hundreds of tons of United States military hardware surrounding his position, like the walls of a room that had materialized around him while he wasn't watching, and the room had no doors that he controlled. The dust was still settling. The diesel engines rumbled and muttered at idle, filling the air with their mechanical voice, a sound with so much presence and persistence that it seemed less like sound and more like weather, something you were inside of rather than something you were hearing. The armored door of the lead JLTV opened. Captain Darnell Okafor stepped out. He was not large in the way that Holt was large, not heavy or imposing in the way of accumulated mass. He was compact and precise, built in the way that people are built who have spent years carrying weight over distance in difficult conditions, lean, dense, economical. His plate carrier was fitted correctly, which is to say invisibly, as though it were simply part of his body. His Kevlar was strapped and level. His M4 was slung in the low-ready position across his chest, the grip accessible, but the muzzle down in the position that says, "I have this," and do not need to prove it by pointing it at anything. His face was the kind of face that had been weathered into its essential structure by years of outdoor operations in hostile environments, not old, but stripped of anything non-essential, so that what remained was the precise geometry of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and exactly why. He did not look at Holt. Two sergeants stepped out of the JLTV behind him, flanking him without crowding him. Their movements synchronized with the practiced naturalness of people who have moved together in tight spaces under pressure for long enough that the coordination has become unconscious. Behind Okafor's vehicle, the rear ramp of the LMTV lowered with a hydraulic whine and then hit the asphalt with a resonant bang, and the Rangers came down it in the steady, measured flow of people who have been trained to move onto ground quickly and quietly, and to arrange themselves in a pattern that serves a tactical purpose without requiring conscious thought. They spread into a loose semicircle around the perimeter of the stop hands, on their weapons muzzles, down eyes covering the space. No one spoke. No one needed to. The presence was sufficient statement. Holt looked at them. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at the numbers and the gear and the scale of what had arrived on this road, and the math did not produce a result he could use. His hand had drifted back to his holster, and then away from it again, and then hovered somewhere in between his body, unable to decide whether the gesture was still relevant. Captain Okafor reached the front of the JLTV and turned. He walked toward the police cruiser. He walked past the hood of the cruiser. He walked to where Elijah Cross stood in handcuffs against the metal of the hood, and he stopped. He came to attention, boots together, chin-level shoulders, back the full structure of a military salute assembled in his posture before his hand even began to rise. So that when the salute arrived, it was the completion of something already built. Not a gesture, but a declaration. The hand rose. The salute was crisp. Textbook, held for exactly as long as it should be held. "Major Cross, sir," Captain Okafor said, his voice carrying through the diesel rumble, with the clarity of a voice trained for exactly this, for being heard over mechanical noise, over wind, over the ambient sound of operations. "Convoy Element Alpha at your position. Awaiting your orders, sir." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Russell Holt understood. It arrived not as a single thought, but as a cascade, a sequence of realizations, each one worse than the previous, moving through him the way water moves through a space when a dam breaks, filling every available volume simultaneously. The man in the gray t-shirt, the man he had called boy, the man whose medals he had dismissed as stolen, the man whose wrists he had cuffed 2 notches too tight, and whose face he had pressed against the tailgate of his own truck. The man who had a captain standing at attention in front of him. The man who had a convoy. Holt's hand fell away from his holster. His knees did not buckle, but they softened the structural integrity of his lower body, compromised by the systemic shock of a reality that was entirely incompatible with every assumption he had made in the last 23 minutes. His face went through several things in rapid succession. The last remnant of the smirk, then confusion, then something that was not quite recognition, because recognition implies a process, and this was instantaneous, then a gray, draining pallor that started at his hairline and moved downward. He looked at the handcuffed man. Elijah Cross looked back at him. He did not smile. He did not show anything that could be called satisfaction. His face was composed into the same calm level expression it had held throughout the expression of a man who had known exactly where this road led since the moment the lights appeared in his rearview mirror, and who had been patient enough to let it arrive on its own. 10 seconds passed, and no one spoke. This was unusual enough that it registered the 24 Rangers holding their perimeter positions. The convoy engines rumbling their patient diesel note, Captain Okafor standing at the dropped salute with his posture still at attention, and Russell Holt standing in the space between his cruiser and the F-100 with his hand at his side and his face the color of old concrete, and his mouth working slightly, trying to construct a sentence that the situation had already rendered impossible. Elijah looked at Holt, and Holt looked at Elijah, and the 10 seconds was not empty. It was full of the accumulated weight of 19 years of impunity and 22 years of service and the particular chemistry of a moment when those two things meet on a gravel shoulder in the Louisiana afternoon, and one of them turns out to be the wall, and one of them turns out to be the thing that hits the wall. Holt tried first. It came out badly. I didn't realize you matched. This was a misunderstanding. The words disintegrated. They had no structure, because the thought behind them had no structure, because there was no thought behind them. Only reflex, only the panicked grasping at the vocabulary of justification that had always worked before in situations where the person across from him had fewer options and less authority, and nowhere to take what had happened. The vocabulary of justification doesn't work when its audience is a convoy. It doesn't work when the audience has M4s slung across their chests and can see from their positions in the semicircle the red indentations pressed into the wrists of the man in handcuffs. Okafor looked at Holt the way you look at a hazard in a landscape, noting it, assessing it, determining that it requires attention, but not alarm. The look itself was enough to stop the grasping sentences. Elijah let the silence return after Holt stopped talking. He let it settle again, let it do its work. Then he spoke. "At ease, Captain," he said. "Let's start with the handcuffs." The sentence was quiet. It was directed at Okafor, but it was designed to be heard by everyone in the space, including Holt, and the specific implication of it, the casual authority of a man who, while standing in handcuffs, is giving orders to a captain who has arrived with 22 vehicles, was the clearest possible statement of the power dynamic without being anything that could be characterized as a threat or a provocation. Okafor moved toward Holt. He covered the distance in 3 strides, each one deliberate, and he stopped at the range where his presence fully occupied Holt's field of awareness, close enough that Holt would have had to step back to maintain comfortable distance, and close enough that stepping back was not something Holt was going to do in front of the people watching. Okafor was several inches shorter than Holt, and perhaps 30 pounds lighter, and he was the most authoritative presence within 100 yards in any direction. And this was evident in a way that had nothing to do with size. He extended one hand palm up open. The gesture needed no explanation. Holt fumbled with his keyring. His hands were shaking a fine constant tremor that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with adrenaline and fear, and the specific neural signature of a person whose body has registered a threat that their conscious mind is still trying to minimize. The key ring slipped once and clattered to the gravel, and Holt went down after it, crouching to retrieve it, and straightened back up, and found Okafor still standing exactly where he'd been, with his hand still open, and handed the keys over without meeting his eyes. Okafor walked around the cruiser to where Elijah stood, inserted the correct key on the first try, and removed the handcuffs from Elijah's wrists. The metal pulled away from skin that had been compressed past the point of circulation, and Elijah brought his arms forward slowly, the movement of a man allowing the feeling to return to his hands, gradually, methodically. Because rushing, it doesn't help, and he knew this, the way he knew most physical things from experience. He rubbed his wrists. He looked at the marks, 2 deep, red-purple indentations pressed into the bone, the skin raw at the edges where the steel had bitten. He rolled his shoulders once, twice the vertebrae resettling. He flexed his fingers until the feeling returned fully, until the hands were his again. Then he turned and looked at Holt. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The convoy's diesel engines provided a steady low undertone to everything he said, and the space around the stop had the specific acoustic quality of open ground with nearby tree cover. Sound carried bounced off the vehicles filled the air evenly so that everyone present could hear every word without Elijah having to project beyond his natural register. What he delivered was not a speech. He was not a man who gave speeches. He was a man who, in the course of his career, had given briefings, precise, organized communications designed to convey exactly what was necessary and nothing that wasn't. What he gave on the shoulder of Highway 9 was a briefing on what had happened in sequence without embellishment or emotional performance, but with the exactness of someone who understood that the record being created right now was a legal document and that legal documents require specificity. He told Holt what Holt had done. He told him that the stop had been initiated without any legitimate traffic violation, that he had been doing 48 in a 55, that his tags were current, that his equipment was legal. He told him that the stated reasons for the stop had been fabricated in sequence as needed, each one replaced by the next when it failed to produce what was wanted. He told him that the term boy had been used twice, which he noted not with visible anger, but with the precision of someone entering a fact into a record. He told him that a loaded weapon had been drawn and pointed at his head without provocation, and he was specific about the weapon, the Glock 22, the angle of the barrel, the proximity to his temple, because specificity is the thing that survives in courtrooms. Then he reached into the duffel, which was still sitting on the passenger seat of the F-100 where Holt had left it, and he took out the shadow box. He held it up and he turned it over right side up so that the decorations on it were visible. The Distinguished Service Cross was the centerpiece, a heavy metal silver hung on a blue and white ribbon awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Above it, the two purple hearts. Below both of them, the precisely folded American flag. He told Holt calmly and without any performative quality what the Distinguished Service Cross was. He told him the specific engagement for which it had been awarded, the Korengal Valley, 2009, an 11-hour contact engagement during which he had moved twice across open ground under direct fire to recover wounded personnel who would not have survived in place. He named the country. He named the valley. He did not name the soldiers he had recovered because they had families and because their names were not Holt's to have. He named the medal and its meaning and the price it represented. He told Holt that he had held up this shadow box and said two words, stolen valor. He paused for a moment. "I want you to understand something," Elijah said, and his voice dropped slightly in the way that voices drop when they are carrying something heavier than the words themselves. A black man in this country is required to be twice as credentialed, twice as compliant, and twice as careful just to arrive home safely from a routine drive. I know this. I have known it since I was old enough to be in a car. I was taught it before I was taught to drive. Today, I did everything right. My speed was legal. My registration was current. I announced every movement. I used the words sir. I offered information about my status as a federal officer. I told you to check my name before escalating." He looked directly at Holt. Holt's eyes were on the gravel. "Look at me, deputy." Holt looked up. "You had a loaded weapon at my head 11 minutes after I pulled over, on the basis of nothing." He held the shadow box steady. "You looked at what I earned bleeding in a valley you will never visit, fighting for a country that included you in the people I was fighting for, and you decided without a second's hesitation that I must have stolen it, because the alternative that a man who looks like me had earned it did not fit into the world as you have constructed it." He set the shadow box carefully on the passenger seat. "That is not a misunderstanding, deputy. A misunderstanding is accidental. What you did today was not an accident. Every choice you made, from the radio call before you even turned on your lights to the cuffs you put on 2 notches past regulation, was deliberate. You have made these choices before. Many times." He held up his phone, showing Holt the active call screen. "Everything that happened here has been broadcasting live on an encrypted military frequency since the moment your lights came on. Captain Okafor and the members of this convoy heard all of it. He looked at Okafor. Captain, has dispatch been notified? Louisiana State Police notified approximately 12 minutes ago, Sir Okafor said without looking at Holt. Calhoun Parish Sheriff's Office duty line notified approximately 11 minutes ago. Both notifications are on record with timestamps. Elijah looked back at Holt. Your decision today ends your career, he said. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction, with the same level even finality with which he would have told a recruit that a particular decision had removed them from consideration for a program. It was a statement of fact delivered in the Register of Facts. I don't require your apology, and I don't want it. What I require is the name of your supervisor and the location of your departmental records division. The rest will be handled through the appropriate federal channels. He folded his hands in front of him and waited. The black Chevrolet Tahoe came over the hill from the north, the direction of the parish seat with its light bar going and its engine working hard to close distance quickly. And it pulled off the road with the aggressive urgency of a vehicle driven by someone who has been told something alarming and is trying to get somewhere before the situation gets worse. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was 54 years old, white, running for his third term in November, on a platform that leaned heavily on the words law and order and community values, and that had previously relied, without his ever needing to acknowledge it explicitly, on the particular community values represented by a clean, quiet, profitable Highway 9 stop operation that generated revenue and kept certain people in their respective places. Pruitt was not a stupid man. He was a calculating man, which in this context was a more dangerous thing to be, because calculation requires accurate information, and for 22 years, his information about Highway 9 had been systematically and deliberately inaccurate, filtered through a chief deputy who had interests in keeping it that way. He was receiving accurate information now from the duty officer who had taken Okafor's call, and the accurate information was doing what accurate information tends to do when it arrives after a long absence. It was causing a rapid and uncomfortable recalculation. He stepped out of the Tahoe and took in the scene. He looked at it the way a man looks at a car accident. The first few seconds are purely inventory, purely the brain cataloging what is present before it begins the harder work of understanding the relationships between the things it sees. The convoy, the JLTVs, the Rangers, the combat captain, and in the center of all of it, his deputy standing pale and deflated and reduced, without his weapon drawn, without his swagger, without the authority he usually wore as naturally as his uniform, and the man in the gray t-shirt standing free of handcuffs holding a shadow box. Pruitt's political instincts, which were 22 years sharp, did the calculation in approximately 4 seconds. He walked toward the cluster of vehicles with the bearing of a man who has decided that his best move is to arrive in front of the situation rather than behind it. But his face was doing things that his bearing was trying to suppress, a tightening around the mouth, a slight forward pressure at the brow. The expression of someone whose next few minutes are going to be a very particular kind of unpleasant. What in the... He stopped himself, recalibrated. What is going on here? He looked at Holt first because Holt was his deputy, and because looking at the military captain felt like acknowledging something he wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. Stone, what did you do? Before Holt could produce anything, and Holt's face suggested that production was not currently a capacity he had available. Elijah stepped forward and presented his military ID with the smooth, practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times and who has long since stopped attaching any anxiety to the gesture. The card was in his left hand, extended at a neutral angle, and his right hand hung loose at his side, visible, unthreatening. Even now, even in this moment, the protocol running automatically. Sheriff Pruitt, I presume, Elijah said. I'm Major Elijah Marcus Cross, United States Army. Your deputy initiated an unlawful traffic stop approximately 25 minutes ago, detained me at gunpoint without probable cause, conducted an illegal search of my vehicle, used racial epithets on 2 occasions, and applied restraints significantly past the regulatory tightness threshold. He indicated his wrists where the marks were still clearly visible. Captain Okafor has the recording of the full interaction from initiation. I would like you to hear it. Pruitt looked at the military ID. He looked at Elijah. He looked at the shadows box that Elijah had tucked under his left arm, the Distinguished Service Cross visible through the glass. He looked at Holt, who was looking at the ground. "Now, hold on," Pruitt said, and his voice had the specific quality of a man who has not yet decided which version of the story is going to serve him best and who is buying time while he makes that determination. "Those are heavy accusations, Major. Deputy Holt is a decorated officer with 19 years on the force," Sheriff Elijah said, and the word landed with a precision that stopped Pruitt mid-sentence. "I'd like you to hear the recording." He looked at Okafor. Okafor reached into the command vehicle and produced the portable speaker unit, a small black box, military grade, designed for use in field briefings, and paired it to his phone, which carried the full audio from the tactical headset transmission. He pressed play. The recording came through the speaker with the fidelity of equipment designed to capture voice communications in high-noise environments, which meant it was remarkably clear. It played from the beginning, the lights going on. The first demand, the first use of the word. The fabricated justifications, cycling through each one more transparent than the last. The unsnap of the retention strap. The count. The draw. Pruitt listened. He did not speak during the recording. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he listened to his deputy's voice filling the afternoon air on Highway 9, and his face underwent the particular evolution of a man who is being shown for the first time the full picture of something he has had only pieces of for a long time, and who is now understanding what those pieces together actually represent. When the recording ended, when the last sound of the handcuffs clicking shut had played, and then the muttered stolen valor in Holt's voice, Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He did not look at Holt. He looked at the ground. Then he looked up at Elijah and said quietly, "What do you need from me, Major?" Holt had been waiting for a lifeline, the way a man treading water waits, not with any particular plan, not with any confidence that one will arrive, but with the specific, desperate passivity of someone who has run out of actions and is now dependent on what arrives. He had been in situations before where things had gone badly, and where the situation had been managed, where Warren had filed the paperwork and the complaint had been processed and the outcome had been clean. He was waiting on some level for that to happen here, for Pruitt to find the angle, for the math to come out differently than it appeared to be coming out. Pruitt looked at him. In that look, the lifeline didn't just fail to arrive. It ceased to be a category of thing that existed. Russell Pruitt said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who has made a calculation and is executing it rather than feeling it. "Give me your weapon and your badge." "Sheriff, please." Holt's voice cracked on the second word, a hairline fracture in the structure of it that widened quickly. The vocal equivalent of a dam giving way. "You've got to listen to me. You know how these stops go." He was the vehicle, I had reasonable, articulable, your weapon, Russell. Now. The word now carried the end of the conversation in it. It was Pruitt's version of the same word that Holt had used 25 minutes ago, and it had the same function. It terminated the possibility of further negotiation, but it was operating in a completely reversed power structure. And Holt heard this, heard the reversal of it, in the specific way that a person hears the thing that confirms what they already somewhere beneath the denial know to be true. Holt's hands moved to his duty belt. The motions were slow, effortful, as though the equipment had become much heavier than it was, as though he were moving against a current. He unholstered the Glock 22, made it safe, and placed it in Pruitt's outstretched hand. Then he unpinned his badge from his shirt, the silver shield that had been the primary instrument of his identity for 19 years, that had preceded him into every interaction, and determined the terms of every relationship he had on this road, and placed it in Pruitt's other hand. Pruitt pocketed both without looking at them. "Turn around," he said. "Hands behind your back." There was a very small pause. Long enough that several of the rangers in the perimeter noted it, and noted that Holt was calculating whether there was a version of this where he didn't comply, and noting that he arrived at the correct conclusion. He turned around. Pruitt's handcuffs were the same model as Holt's, The same steel, the same locking mechanism, the same sound, that metallic ratcheting click that is one of the most recognizable sounds in American law enforcement, and that carries with it, for different people, profoundly different associations. For Elijah, standing with his arms at his sides, watching the sound was not satisfying in any simple way. It was accurate. It was what the situation required. It was the first correct procedural thing that had happened since the lights had gone on in his rearview mirror, and there was something in that, in the fact that the system was, however slowly and however messily and however contingently, producing an accurate outcome that was not exactly hope and not exactly vindication, but was something in the neighborhood of both, something that existed in the specific emotional register of a man who has been doing the right thing for a very long time, and who is watching the world for once do the right thing back. Holt was placed in the rear seat of Pruitt's Tahoe. The door closed. Through the tinted window, Elijah could see the shape of Holt, the slumped posture, the head bent forward, the entire physical vocabulary of a man from whom the animating force has been removed. He did not look defiant. He did not look angry. He looked simply and entirely like someone who had run out of road. Okafor gave the order quietly, and the convoy began to reorganize. Vehicles moved back into formation, the mechanical ballet of 22 units returning to road order, the LMTV pulling back into the northbound lane, the JLTVs repositioning the Rangers, reloading into the transport. The sound of it was enormous and took several minutes, and when it was done, the road was again just a road, though the tire tracks in the gravel shoulder would remain for 2 weeks, and several Calhoun Parish residents who drove that stretch would note them and wonder. Elijah picked up the canvas duffel from the passenger seat of the F-100. He checked the shadow box, turned it right side up, wiped the dust from the glass with his thumb, and placed it carefully back inside. He checked the duffel's other contents. The folded flag, the maintenance records that Holt had thrown on the floorboard, which he retrieved and replaced in their folder, the flashlight, the pen. He zipped the duffel. He looked at the road ahead. He got into the truck. He started the engine, let it warm for 30 seconds, as he always did, and pulled back onto Highway 9. He drove at exactly 48 miles per hour, both hands at 10 and 2. The recording landed on the desk of Special Agent in Charge Vivian Holloway at approximately 7:15 in the morning, 41 hours after the stop on Highway 9. Holloway was 51 years old. Black had been with the FBI's Civil Rights Division for 16 years and had spent the better part of the last decade working cases in the Gulf Coast region that shared certain features, small, tight jurisdictions where law enforcement operated with limited external oversight, communities where the cultural cost of filing a complaint was high enough to function as an effective deterrent to reporting. Documented patterns of racially targeted enforcement that had been allowed to accumulate into something structural because the mechanism designed to address them, internal affairs, was staffed by people with personal interests in their continuance. She had seen these cases in their early stages when they were still thin files and vague complaints, and she had seen them in their later stages when the thin files had become federal indictments and the vague complaints had become testimony. She listened to the recording in full once through with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the desk, and then she listened to it again with a legal pad in front of her, on which she made notes. When she was done with the second listen, she looked at what she had written and then looked at the agent who had delivered the recording, a young man named Carlisle, who was still reading the anticipation in her expression. "How long has this deputy been active on this road?" she asked. 19 years, Carlisle said. His logged stops on Highway 9, specifically just that road, go back 11 years in the digital records. The earlier years would be paper. "Get me everything," she said. "All of it. Paper included." She paused. "And get me Warren Greer's personnel file." "The chief deputy. He's the brother-in-law, correct?" "Correct. His file?" "His complaint log, his complaint disposition record. Everything he has ever signed off on regarding Russell Holt." "Everything." Carlisle nodded and left, and Holloway sat for a moment in the specific silence of a person who has seen something that confirms a pattern she has been tracing for a long time, and who understands that confirmation, while not satisfying in a simple way, is the necessary prerequisite to action. She picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The first was to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baton Rouge to give notice that the Civil Rights Division would be initiating a formal investigation and would require coordination on potential federal charges under Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law and related statutes. The second was to her counterpart at the Louisiana State Police to formalize the relationship with their own investigation, which had been initiated when Okafor's notification came through. The third was brief and internal to the head of her field team with 2 words: start packing. 48 hours after the stop on Highway 9, a team of 7 FBI agents drove into Calhoun Parish in 3 unmarked vehicles. They did not stop at the sheriff's office. They did not call ahead. They went directly to the Records Division, a room in the basement of the Parish Administrative Building that also housed payroll and property assessment, and they presented a federal warrant, and they began. They imaged every hard drive in the division within the first 2 hours. They identified and preserved the complete digital dashcam archive, which covered 11 years of stops on Highway 9 and surrounding routes. They pulled Holt's complete arrest record, including the 31 complaints filed against him and the disposition record for each one, which, as they had anticipated, showed 31 entries for complaint received and 31 entries for complaint dismissed, insufficient evidence, or complaint dismissed officer conduct within departmental guidelines, signed in each case by Warren Greer. What the records revealed over the weeks of analysis that followed was not a single bad actor operating in isolation. It was a pattern-specific, documented, statistically inescapable, that had been operating on Highway 9 for the better part of a decade with the full knowledge and active cooperation of the departmental structure designed to prevent it. Of the 214 stops Holt had logged on Highway 9 over 6 years, 91% had involved black drivers. 78% had produced no citation, no ticket, no charge, no record of any legitimate outcome from the stop, just a notation and a return to patrol. Of the remaining 22%, the vast majority of resulting charges had been minor and had produced outcomes that, in retrospect and with the dashcam footage now available for review, were difficult to characterize as anything other than manufactured. The dashcam footage itself was the most damning archive. 11 years of recording, and in stop after stop after stop, the same pattern was visible. Black drivers pulled over on thin or absent pretexts, subjected to searches that produced nothing, released without citation. No record created except the stop notation. The footage did not capture audio, which was why the tactical headset recording from Elijah's F-100 was uniquely valuable. It was the first time that Holt's verbal conduct during a stop had been captured in its entirety. And what it captured was consistent with what the victims who eventually came forward would describe. Warren Greer was placed on administrative leave 71 hours after the federal agents arrived in the parish. He hired a criminal defense attorney within the hour, which was the correct decision and also an indication that he understood exactly what the investigation was going to find. The police union issued its statement of support for Russell Holt on day 2 of the federal investigation. It was a standard statement, the kind that had been issued many times before in similar situations. Expressions of confidence in due process, assertions of the presumption of innocence language about the challenges faced by law enforcement officers in the field. It was retracted 18 hours later after the audio recording was leaked to 3 national television networks and played in excerpts on the evening news. The union's legal counsel reviewed the case within 12 hours of the broadcast and informed the leadership that the conduct documented in the recording was under the terms of the union charter, explicitly outside the scope of conduct for which the union provided legal defense. The retraction was issued the following morning. The cracks appeared in a specific order, which is the way they always appear from the outside in, from the people with the most to lose, starting with the people whose loyalty was always conditional, and moving toward the people who believed it was unconditional, and discovering in the worst possible way that they were wrong. 3 deputies from the Calhoun Parish Sheriff's Office made contact with Holloway's office voluntarily in the first 5 days. This was not altruism, it was calculation. The calculation of people who understood what the Federal Records Review would eventually find and who had learned enough from watching other investigations to know that the first people through the door with information got better outcomes than the people who waited to see what happened. All three provided sworn statements. All three described with a consistency that suggested shared experience rather than coordination. The culture that had existed on Highway 9 for as long as they had been in the department, the understanding that certain roads and certain drivers were Holt's territory. The knowledge that complaints against Holt went to Greer and came back clean, the specific instruction given to incoming deputies that what happened during Highway 9 stops was not their business and was not to be discussed. One of the three told Holloway about a conversation he had overheard 6 years earlier in the break room between Holt and a deputy who no longer worked for the department. He had not filed a report at the time. He was filing one now. The conversation he described was specific enough and consistent enough with the documentary record to be useful. Holt's wife, Carolyn, had not waited for the union's retraction. She had called her sister in Nashville on the evening of the day the recording aired and had made arrangements within 48 hours. A moving truck appeared at the house Holt had shared with his family for 14 years, and the contents of the house, the furniture, the children's things, the accumulated material evidence of a life were loaded into it over the course of a morning and driven north. She issued no statement. There was nothing she wished to say that would not have made things either better or worse. And she was not able to determine which. Warren Greer, once the scope of the federal investigation became apparent, began a process that was characterized by his attorney as proactive cooperation, and that more accurately resembled the behavior of a man standing at the back of a building as it catches fire, trying to determine which exit is least likely to collapse. He provided Holloway's team with access to the physical complaint files, the paper records predating the digital system, the ones in the filing cabinets that no one had asked about because no one had known to ask, and these turned out to contain something that the digital records had been carefully edited to exclude 4 prior complaints against Holt, in which the claimant specifically stated that a weapon had been drawn during the stop. 4 separate incidents documented in the original paper files in which black drivers on Highway 9 had filed complaints stating that Holt had drawn his service weapon without provocation. 4 complaints that Greer had received, reviewed, and dismissed without further action. The dismissals documented in the paper files in Greer's handwriting. The files also contained something else, 3 complaints that had been filed, and then according to the paper trail formally withdrawn by the complainant. Holloway's team tracked down 2 of the 3 complainants. Neither of them had withdrawn their complaint willingly. Both of them described with varying specificity a conversation with a representative of the sheriff's office. They could not name the representative, but the description was consistent, in which they had been advised that withdrawal would be in their best interest. Holloway added these to the file. Sheriff Pruitt held a press conference on Day 6 in the parking lot of the Calhoun Parish Administrative Building with the specific body language of a man performing containment. He stood at a portable lectern with the department's seal on a banner behind him, and he stated that Deputy Russell Holt did not represent the values of this department and that the department was committed to full cooperation with the federal investigation, and that the events on Highway 9 were not a reflection of the character of law enforcement in Calhoun Parish. He answered 2 questions before his communications director indicated that the time available had expired. In the back of a federal detention facility outside Baton Rouge, Holt had stopped expecting to be rescued. The federal courthouse in Baton Rouge occupies a full city block on Main Street, and it has the particular architectural character of buildings designed to communicate the permanence and authority of the institution. They house heavy stone tall windows, the kind of scale that makes the human figures entering and leaving. It looks small by comparison, which is not accidental. On the morning that United States versus Russell Holt began, the building's south steps were occupied by a loose cluster of people who had driven or been driven to be there: journalists with equipment, members of several civil rights organizations who had been following the case since the recording aired, and a smaller group of individuals who stood apart from both, quieter, less organized, their presence more personal than professional. These were people who had driven Highway 9. 6 of them had been contacted by Holloway's office after the records review identified their stops in Holt's archive. All 6 had agreed to testify. They came from different parts of the parish and different circumstances. A nurse, a retired teacher, a man who ran a small landscaping business, a woman who had been on her way to a job interview, a college student, a grandfather who had been taking his grandchildren to a baseball game. Their experiences were specific and individual, and collectively told a story that the documentary record confirmed but could not fully express, because documents do not capture what it is to be a person at the side of a road, at the mercy of a man who has been made accountable to nothing. They sat together in the 4th row of the gallery, and they were quiet. Holt sat at the defense table, and the transformation from the man on Highway 9 was substantial enough that several of the journalists noted it in their coverage. He had lost approximately 30 pounds in the months since the arrest, the weight of the impunity. Perhaps that had been a kind of sustenance, and that had been removed. He wore a suit that had been purchased for the trial, and that fit imperfectly, too large in the shoulders, the gesture of a man whose body had changed faster than his wardrobe could accommodate. His court-appointed public defender, a young attorney named Daniel Whitfield, was competent and conscientious, and was going to lose this case, and he knew it, and was managing this knowledge with the professional equanimity of someone who has made peace with unfavorable odds. Federal prosecutor Adrian Cole stood at the government table with the contained energy of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 8 months and is going to use every bit of that preparation. She was 43 years old, had prosecuted 11 civil rights cases under Title 18 in her career, and had a conviction rate that reflected not luck, but a specific quality of preparation that her colleagues described, usually with some mixture of admiration and exhaustion, as comprehensive. She had read every document in the case file. She had spoken to every witness. She had listened to the recording so many times that she could identify by ear the exact point where the second use of the slur appeared in the audio. When she rose to give her opening statement, she was brief. There were cases, she told the jury, where the evidence required extensive interpretation, where you had to hold things up to the light and turn them and explain what you were seeing. This was not one of those cases. This was a case where a government officer drew a loaded weapon on an unarmed man he had stopped without cause, and this was a case where every word of what followed was captured on an audio recording of extraordinary clarity, and her job for the next several days was simply to play it for them and ensure they understood what they were hearing. She played the recording in full, start to finish, without commentary. The courtroom was silent during it. There is a particular quality to the silence that descends on a room full of people listening to something they are not able to ignore, something dense and attentive, almost physical. The recording lasted 23 minutes, and in those 23 minutes, the jury heard the stop develop from its beginning, heard each fabricated justification added in sequence, heard the slurs twice, heard the count begin and stop at 2, heard the sound of the holster opening and the subsequent escalation. They heard the handcuffs. They heard stolen valor in Holt's voice, quiet and contemptuous. When it was over, Cole did not speak for a moment. She let the silence after the recording do its work, which was considerable. Then she said, "The defense will characterize this as a moment of poor judgment under stress." You will hear that phrase, poor judgment. I want you to consider what judgment means. Judgment is a choice. At each step of what you just heard, Deputy Holt made choices to escalate, to fabricate, to draw his weapon, to dismiss evidence that contradicted his predetermined conclusion. Poor judgment is a single bad choice in a moment of genuine confusion. What you heard was a sequence. What you heard was a man doing what he had always done, confident that what he had always done would continue to produce what it had always produced. She sat down. Whitfield, for the defense, argued stress. He argued the inherent difficulty of field decisions. He argued that the audio, while concerning, captured a situation that had been misread by his client due to the accumulated pressures of 19 years of high-stakes law enforcement work. He argued that the weapon had been drawn as a protective measure in response to a perceived threat, the defendant's belief, however mistaken, that the situation warranted it. He was careful not to argue that nothing had happened. He could not argue that nothing had happened. The audio existed, and the audio was what it was. He arrived on the 4th day of trial, the final witness for the prosecution, and he wore his Class A uniform. The Distinguished Service Cross was at his chest, the ribbon its specific blue and white, the medal itself catching the courtroom's overhead lighting when he moved. The two Purple Hearts were above his left breast pocket, and beside them a row of additional decorations, whose specifics the jury could not fully read, but whose density communicated something about the length and depth of the career they represented. His shoes were polished to the mirror finish that had been described months earlier in more than one news article about the Highway 9 stop. He moved to the witness stand with the same measured, purposeful quality that he carried everywhere, took the oath with his right hand raised and his posture straight, and sat. Cole's examination was structured, but not long. She established his background rank, years of service, the specific engagements from which the decorations had been earned. She walked him through the stop in the same sequence the audio had already established, adding the dimension that the audio could not provide the physical experience of it, what it felt like to have a weapon at his temple, to have his face pressed against the tailgate of his own truck, to have his hands bound too tightly while he watched his medals be dismissed as stolen. He described all of this without visible emotion. Not because he felt none, anyone who listened carefully could hear the specific weight of certain words, the slight thickening of his voice when he described watching the shadow box that represented 11 hours in the Korengal Valley, being face down on the floorboard of his truck. But he controlled the expression of it with the precision of someone who understands that what the courtroom needs from him right now is not his feelings, but his facts, and that his facts, presented in sequence, are the most powerful testimony available. When Cole concluded her examination and sat, Whitfield approached the podium for cross-examination with the careful posture of a man entering a space he knows is not advantageous. He asked Elijah whether at any point during the stop he could have identified himself as a military officer. More explicitly produced his military ID, stated his rank in a way that might have altered the trajectory of the interaction. Elijah was quiet for a moment. The moment lasted long enough that the courtroom noticed it, and in that moment the jury was watching the face of a man who was choosing with great care the most accurate way to say the most important thing. I identified myself as a federally employed officer, Elijah said, and I stated clearly that Deputy Holt should run my name before escalating. That is the information I provided. He paused. But I want to address the assumption underlying your question because I think it's important. You're suggesting that if I had established my military credentials more explicitly, if I had been more insistent about demonstrating that I belonged to a category of person worthy of not being shot, the situation would have gone differently. He looked at Whitfield, and then he looked at the jury because the answer was for them. That may be true, but that is not accountability. That is a different kind of injustice. A citizen of the United States does not need a military rank to be entitled to drive on a public road without having a weapon pointed at their head. I should not have to produce a shadow box full of combat decorations to justify my right to not be held at gunpoint on a pretext. If the only version of this story in which I get to go home safely is the version where I can prove I have a sufficiently impressive resume, then the problem on that road was not solved. It was just redirected to the next person who doesn't happen to have a Distinguished Service Cross in their glove compartment. Whitfield had no follow-up question. He returned to his table. Cole declined redirect. Elijah stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to his seat in the gallery. And as he passed the row where the 6 Highway 9 witnesses sat, he did not look at them directly, but several of them saw his face and the expression on it, not triumphant, not satisfied, but resolved, determined the expression of a man for whom this is not the end of something, but the necessary completion of it was one that they would remember. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The deliberation took 6 hours. Not because the case was ambiguous, it was not, but because 12 people take their responsibility seriously when they understand that the outcome of their decision is not an abstraction, that it will determine the next significant portion of a specific human life, that getting it right matters in a way that is personal and direct and not reducible to a formula. They asked to hear 2 sections of the audio recording again. They reviewed the dashcam analysis. They looked for some time at the complaint records, the 31 complaints, the 31 dismissals, each one signed in the same handwriting. They took their time. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, Holt was standing at the defense table with his hands flat on the wood surface, as though the table were something that needed to be held in place. His breathing was visible from the gallery, the slight rise and fall of his chest at an elevated rate, the respiration of a man managing anxiety at the edge of its capacity to be managed. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, the foreperson read, the jury find the defendant, Russell Edward Holt, guilty. On the count of aggravated assault on a federal officer, guilty. On the count of filing a false police report, guilty. On the count of civil rights conspiracy, as charged in connection with the documented pattern of racially targeted enforcement, supported by the internal complaint record, guilty. Each verdict landed in the courtroom with the acoustic character of something that has been falling for a long time and has finally reached the ground. The gallery did not erupt. It was not that kind of room, and these were not that kind of people. Several of the 6 Highway 9 witnesses held hands. One of them pressed her free hand against her mouth and was quiet in a way that encompassed more than one feeling at once. Elijah in the 3rd row sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes straight ahead, and his expression was the expression of a man receiving information he had expected to receive, and for whom correct outcomes, however long delayed, are what justice is supposed to produce, a thing to be acknowledged rather than celebrated. Because acknowledgement is honest, and celebration would imply that it was more than it should have been required to be. Judge Patricia Odom presided over the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later. She was 58 years old, had been on the federal bench for 14 years, had been appointed after a career as a federal prosecutor, during which she had developed a reputation for the precise and economical construction of arguments, not flashy, not theatrical, but built so solidly that they rarely failed in the courtroom and essentially never failed on appeal. On the bench, she had carried this quality into her judicial conduct. She did not grandstand. She did not moralize beyond what the record required. And when she sentenced, she did so with the specificity of someone who believes that words should mean exactly what they say, and that sentencing is a communication that the person receiving it should be able to understand completely. She looked at Holt for a long moment before speaking. He was standing, as required, his hands at his sides, the suit fitting no better than it had 2 weeks ago. His attorney stood beside him. His face was still not composed, but used up the way a face looks when the processes that animate expression have been running at maximum capacity for months and have finally run down. Mr. Holt, Judge Odom, began, her voice measured and clear, carrying in the relatively small space of the courtroom without effort. The court has reviewed the evidence presented at trial, the victim impact statements, the pre-sentencing report, and the relevant sentencing guidelines. I want to speak to you directly before I impose sentence, because I think certain things should be said in plain language. She set the pre-sentencing report aside and looked at him. You were given authority. Authority in its most immediate daily physical form, the authority to stop people, to detain them, to search them, to determine in real time the terms of their interaction with the power of the state. That authority is not given because the person receiving it is superior to the people they govern. It is given because someone at some point determined that organized law enforcement serves a community better than no law enforcement. It is a practical arrangement, not a moral hierarchy. She paused, allowing that to settle. You treated it as a moral hierarchy. You treated it as confirmation of something you already believed, that your judgment about people based on the color of their skin was correct and was legitimized by the badge you wore. You used a federal highway as a private hunting ground. You drew a loaded weapon on a man who has given more to this country than you have asked of yourself in your entire career, and you dismissed the proof of that contribution as stolen because the alternative, that the contribution was real, was incompatible with the story you had decided was true. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The law provides for a range of sentences for the offenses of which you've been convicted. I am sentencing you to 168 months, 14 years in federal custody, to be served without the possibility of early parole. Your municipal pension is hereby seized in its entirety. Restitution payments in amounts specified in the court's order are to be made to each of the 6 complainants who testified in this proceeding. She picked up the gavel. This sentence reflects not only the conduct on Highway 9 on August 23rd, but the documented pattern of conduct that the Highway 9 incident was part of and that the investigation revealed. 19 years of service do not mitigate conduct of this kind. They contextualize it as 19 years of choosing to do what the record shows you chose to do on roads where you believed you would never be required to account for it. She brought the gavel down. The sound of it in the courtroom was a single clean final note. The U.S. Marshals came forward from their positions. They moved to Holt with the professional efficiency of people for whom this is a routine function, not unkindly, but without any accommodation for drama. They turned him and brought his hands behind his back and closed the handcuffs. The same click, the same cold steel, the same 2 notches, or perhaps these were regulated properly, but the sound was the same. And for the people in that courtroom who had heard the recording, the sound carried its full weight of meaning. Holt's legs did not fail this time. He walked out through the side door under his own power, and the door closed behind him, and the room was very quiet for a moment. In the 3rd row, Elijah exhaled. It was a single contained breath, in and out, deliberate the way UVs breathe after something that required a great deal of air. He unclasped his hands, which he had held together in his lap throughout the sentencing, and rested them on his thighs. He did not look around the room for reactions or acknowledgments. He looked at the front of the courtroom, at the empty bench where Judge Odom had sat, at the seal of the federal judiciary mounted on the wall above it, at the flag standing at the far end of the bar. He sat with it for a moment. Then he retrieved his dress uniform cap from the seat beside him, and walked out of the courtroom. 3 months after the sentence was handed down, Elijah Marcus Cross drove Highway 9 again. He drove it in the same direction at the same time of day, in the same 1971 Ford F-100, at the same 48 miles per hour in the 55 zone. The afternoon light came through the same pine trees at the same angle. The yellow dividing lines were a little more faded than they had been in August. It was November. Now the air cooler, the light lower and less brutal. But the road was the same road. He passed the billboard for the Shreveport personal injury law firm. He passed the pull-off where Holt used to park, hidden in the shoulder's shadow, waiting. A new patrol unit was there now. A different car, a different deputy, younger, hired under the terms of the federal consent decree that had been placed on the Calhoun Parish Sheriff's Department 60 days after Holt's arrest, a decree that mandated body cameras, mandatory de-escalation training, an independent civilian oversight board, and a complete overhaul of the complaint processing system that would remove it from the control of any person related by blood or marriage to any officer being complained against. The deputy inside the new car looked up as the F-100 rolled by, noted the truck with the mild professional attention of a person doing their job, and raised one hand from the steering wheel in the easy, unremarkable gesture of a wave. Elijah returned the gesture without slowing down. The canvas duffel was on the passenger seat, the shadow box inside it where it had always been. The road ahead was straight and empty. He drove it until the parish line, and then he drove past it, and the pine barrens fell away behind him, and the highway opened up, and he was just a man in an old truck going somewhere he had always been going. In a federal correctional facility outside Shreveport, Russell Holt was learning things about the world that the pull-off on Highway 9 had protected him from learning. The men who shared his unit knew what he had been. News traveled in federal corrections with a speed and completeness that the free world's information systems rarely achieved, and they knew what he had done to people on roads where they had had no recourse, and they treated him with the specific patient contempt that people reserve for those who abused power against the powerless. He had no badge. He had no holster. He had no brother-in-law to sign the paperwork. He had a bunk and a meal schedule and 14 years in which to develop a more complete understanding of what it means to be the least powerful person in a room, which had been the experience of the people he stopped on Highway 9 every time he turned on his lights, and which he was now experiencing with a thoroughness that left nothing out. Warren Greer had pleaded guilty to obstruction of federal civil rights proceedings and was serving a 3-year term in a minimum security facility. Sheriff Pruitt had not been charged. The investigation had not produced evidence that he had known about Holt's weapon-drawing incidents before the Highway 9 stop, though what it had produced was extensive evidence of a broader culture of willful ignorance that had made those incidents possible. But he had not run for re-election. He was in the private sector now, consulting on something that no one in Calhoun Parish could quite identify. Highway 9 was still Highway 9. The same crumbling asphalt, the same pine barrens, the same afternoon light, doing its particular work through the trees. But the pull-off behind the billboard was occupied now by a different kind of presence, answerable to different people, operating under different rules. And the road was, for the first time in a long time, simply a road, which is what a road is supposed to be. If you found this story meaningful and want to see more stories about accountability, justice, and the people who refuse to be broken by the systems designed to break them, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.